Welcome to Chapter 5, Language is a Barrier. We all speak English to a certain extent. But what really is language? I mean, what is it? It's basically an agreed upon set of symbols. We are going to say this is a cup or a plastic cup or whatever you want to call it. This is a book. This is a pen. In German, that would be a Kugelschreiber. In German, this would be a book. Kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? Well, there's about 7,100 separate languages, according to the textbook. And what that doesn't take into account or into consideration is the different dialects. Now, I learned German when I was in school, but they taught us Hochdeutsch, High German. And when I was in Bavaria, southern Germany, a lot of it didn't make sense. Just like if you were down here, last night I was watching some funny videos on YouTube or something, and it was Steve Harvey and Family Feud, but it was a focus on people with southern accents and how a lot of people can't understand them. So, I mean, they're speaking American. I hate to use the term English in this context because we aren't really speaking English. I had a translator, and I don't know if I told you this or not, but I had a translator when I was in Kyrgyzstan, and we told her our boss said we couldn't have tea, and tea was actually cognac and vodka in the middle of the day. And I said, our boss said we can't have it. And this guy I was working with named Charlie Brown, he was a black guy, and we were working together, and we said, no, our boss said we can't. And her name was Valentina, and she looked it up in her dictionary. She said, boss. She learned the Queen's English, and she had a Queen's English dictionary. And she looked at, oh, boss, master. And Charlie and I looked at one another and said, no, we don't use that word no more. Okay? So this book looks at a couple of different barriers to culture and languages of varying communication. One of them is a translation problem. And some of you may know enough of another language to understand sometimes there's a problem when you try to translate something. I, in English, American, ich in German, ja in Russian, they all mean me, okay? But there are some words that they have different words for a different event or a different situation. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, reality is embedded in language. Therefore, language controls thought and cultural norms. Now, this guy said that, he went to study different languages, and he said that the language that we know controls how we think and our cultural norms. And one of the examples he used was the Hopi Native Americans, or indigenous people, or First Americans, whatever you want to call them, whatever they prefer to be called, did not have a word for past, present, or future time. We say, I ran, I'm running, I'm going to run, but there was no difference. So according to him, the only thing that you can see as reality is the words that you understand. For example, the Alaskans have many different words for snow. Well, some people would argue, and we'll get into that in a minute, that I don't need 20 different words for 20 different types of snow. I can say snow is soft, snow is hard, snow is this, snow is that. What else did he do? He said that the Hanu tribe had 92 different words for rice. And Native Australians don't have words for left and right. They look at they look at the situation from a world perspective, east and west, as opposed to left and right, as a, not looking at it from my point, from the world point. Additionally, grammar and syntax causes some problems. And for example, Eskimos use the word if instead of when. Theoretically, according to this theory, is because they have very harsh lives and the future is not set in stone. It's still questionable. We can't control it, and if you say this is going to happen, it seems kind of arrogant that you know the future. But think of these two sentences, and the book used a good example. When I graduate, I mean that's what you say because you're going to graduate and get out of here. But in the Eskimo tradition, it would be more appropriate to say if I graduate. Well, what does that mean to you in your tradition? If no, I'm gonna graduate. No, don't do this if stuff. What do you mean if? So we have no control over the future according to the Eskimos' cultural beliefs. Therefore, we cannot say it's a definitive. Additionally, not every language uses the subject, verb, object thing that we use in the United States. That was one of the hardest things for me to learn other languages, is that I wanted to put it in American context, American grammar, syntax. And it didn't make sense to whoever I was speaking with if I put a sentence in our syntax. And you probably heard somebody from another country speak English, broken English, we'll just use that term, and it didn't sound right to you. They had the words, but it didn't flow, it didn't follow like it should. So, different languages have different the verb, subject, and context, object type stuff going on. The book uses an example of in Japan. In Japan, I'd say I brought my book with me, but a Japanese student would say brought book, because it's understood that you brought your book. If I say brought book, it's understand I brought my book. It's not like, well, my mom brought it for me. Brought book covers it. And there's a lot of different short cuts that we use, especially nowadays since we're using these things for communication. And texting, we use shortcuts all the time. But that's not the quote norm. Although, if we continue to text, it will be our norm. So criticisms of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, Whorf's research methods was one of the biggest ones. A lot of people is like, did he even meet with Hopi people? Did he delve into it? Did he understand it, or did he just make an assumption? Because one or two people told him something. Another one is translatability. More words do not mean it's not understandable. So the Eskimos might have one word for slushy snow. Does that mean that two words when we say slushy snow doesn't equate to the same thing? We might have to use 3 or 4 words to describe a specific snow event that they can use one for. So translation, it doesn't fit word for word, and because of that, the belief that we can't understand that concept if we don't have one word for it, as opposed to 5, is wrong. Next, the book talks about linguistic relativism. Well, what is that? Well, short and sweet, you can read the whole thing. I hope you read the whole chapter. But linguistic relativism is that the characteristics and cultural norms influence each other. It's not just that your language creates your culture and your characteristics and the norms. That your norms create language, and language create norms. And then it talks about bilingual people. It uses an explanation of bilingual people to solidify this idea of linguistic relativism. This is something I like to ask my class as a whole. And I really don't like doing something like this on a video because I don't get the feedback from you that I'm looking for. But generally in class, I'll ask my students, what do you call somebody who speaks two languages? And I'll wait, and somebody will go, bilingual. I say, okay. What about three? And I'll wait, and somebody will go, trilingual. I say, okay, four. And somebody quadrilingual. I say, okay, one. And they'll look at me and say, American. We in America tend to speak one language. And I honestly think that it hurts us as a culture and as a country. I grew up in the military. I traveled the world. My kids were there. We traveled the world. When my kids were in kindergarten and first grade, they were learning both German and English. Most European students can speak two, three, four languages. I can get by in a couple, but I'm not fluent in any. The more, if I go back, like I was gone from Kyrgyzstan, and then I went back to Kazakhstan 12 years later. And en route, I traveled through Germany, which was about 15 years later. And when I was sitting there immersed for 6 hours in the airport, it started coming back to me. And when I went to Kazakhstan, which when I was in Kyrgyzstan was part of the Soviet Union, therefore they spoke Russian. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, now they speak Kyrgyz. In Kazakhstan, they spoke Russian. Now they speak Kazakh. But because I had a basic understanding of Russian, I could still communicate with a lot of people. So I think it's imperative that we teach our children different languages. I speak different languages to my grandchildren all the time. Is it going to make them fluent in any language? No, it's not. But I hope that it allows them to become better at it if they choose to learn another language. The book talks about the Arabic language in Arabia. And the Arabic language is interconnected with Islam. And the Quran is basically the cornerstone of the language. And there is a lot of people that speak Arabic because to be a Muslim, you must pray in Arabic. Now, does that mean that Arabic is solid, steadfast, and no, it's not. It's like other languages growing. It is changing with time. I mean, if you think about it, we did not have a word for automobile until we had an automobile. We didn't have a word for a computer until we had a computer. In France, it's they're trying to shelter their language and protect it because American words are creeping in like mouse and computer and email. And inside the book talks about the different French words that they want to use instead of the American words. But if you think about it, languages get this intermingling all the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Arabic is interconnected with Islam, and it's often more flowery than the American language we speak. And it confuses a lot of people when they try to translate it because instead of just, how are you look well today, it might be a whole bunch of other stuff with it. So how do we deal with that translation? Because a lot of times it's not just one or the other. So the translation problems are the vocabulary equivalents. What is the vocabulary equivalent to this? I, ish, ya, All three mean me. But that vehicle out there, das Auto, the car, they kind of sound the same. Mattress, matrice. Matrice is the Russian word for mattress. So there's the direct correlation there. It's easy, but a lot of times there's not one. For example, if we just say snow and we're trying to translate it to one of the 30 or 40 different, or 15 or 40 different types of snow, what is it? Idiomatic equivalence. What does that mean? Oh, it's a piece of cake. What does that mean to somebody that doesn't speak English? Don't cry over spilled milk. A lot of times you can't translate those to where they have the same meaning that we have. Grammatical and syntax equivalence. Like I mentioned earlier, we have subject, verb, object. And a lot of countries don't. So how is that translated to make up for that? Do you add it in? Do you leave it out? Experiential equivalence. If you have never experienced it, how can you translate it to something that is understandable? And I mean, right now we have the internet and World Wide Web, and we have all this other stuff, and we can see videos of all this stuff happening, and it's neat. But think about before that. The first plane that flew. How can I explain it to somebody that never saw a plane fly? The first car. How can you explain that? If you catch a certain type of fish and nobody else catches that fish anywhere else in the world, how can you explain it other than, well, it's a fish and it swims in the water? So if we haven't experienced it, how can we do it? A blind person that has never seen, how do you tell them what the color red looks like? You can't. Conceptual equivalence. What's the concept that we're dealing with? If we don't understand this concept, how can we translate it? Well, the book talks about doing a lot of things, and one of them is called back translation. And I've had to do this before when I did a research paper on relationships with people with disabilities. And so the questionnaire was in English. We had it translated to Arabic, and then we had it translated back to English, and we looked and seen to see if the question was still the same. And the best to have two different translators doing this, because if the translator said, if I translated from English to German and the German to English, I knew what I was wanting to say. So you get two different translators. You translate the question from the origin language to another language, and then have somebody different translate it back. And if the questions still match, the statements still match, then it's a good translation. But you might get something that really doesn't make sense at all. Now, I was at a conference in Mexico City, and we had headphones, and we had real-time translators. I speak a little bit of Russian, a little bit of German, a little bit of French, Spanish. I'm not too good on it. Portuguese, I don't know nothing about. Well, the Argentine or the Brazilian participants were speaking in Portuguese. The rest of the South American were speaking in Spanish, and the other North Americans were speaking in English. So when I was speaking in English, somebody was translating what I was saying real time to everybody with headphones on so they can understand. I had this wonderful speaker from Cuba, and he was so engrossed in what he was saying. and he was using body language, and he was changing his voice, and he was doing everything he was supposed to do. But the translator was, and today I went down to the store and got the newspaper because I needed to read the newspaper to find out if the article was in there about the murder that I saw last night. It was so boring listening to this translator because he had to think on the fly and tell exactly what was said in a language I could understand it, and then be ready for the next thing. So you lose a whole lot in real-time translation. But human translation is better because a human can understand all the idiosyncrasies and the differences, and they can compensate. Machines, now we can translate them. You got Google Translate and all these other translates on your phones, and that's great, but they are limited and only as good as their data set. They might be able to tell you the sky is blue, but they may not be able to add all the other things in there that make it a textural picture that you can understand. So pigeons and creoles and Esperanto. A pigeon is two or more groups getting together and creating a language so they can function and operate. Take a little from me, I take a little from you. We might have this French influence, we both know. When I was in Kyrgyzstan, I had a driver that lived he was in the Russian army stationed in East Germany for 7 years. I was in the American army stationed in West Germany, and so we both knew some German. And it would drive our interpreter Valentin up the wall when I started speaking German to him. And he would speak German to me. But he also knew a couple of English words. And I also knew a couple of Russian words. And so we would throw these in there, and Valentina was just going back and forth. And one day she told me, you have to stop that. I'm getting paid to translate for you. I can't translate if I don't know what you're saying. So, Pidgin, where two people kind of create a language that they can use. Creole is, and then the first time I read it, it's like, well, what's the difference? 2 to 3 people get together and create a new language. Okay. Well, the difference is the language is taught to people as their first language. A Creole language, people learn as their first language. They don't learn English as their first language. They don't learn Spanish as their first language. They learn this mixture as their first language, or French and English. In the example of Cajun or Louisiana Creole. Esperanto was an attempt to create a new language, a universal language. It had some problems. It kind of fell apart. There's some people that speak it, but it's not a universal language. Languages and nationalism. The textbook talks about, different countries, and they want this to be our national language. Some countries have multiple national languages. Canada's got 2. U.S. does not have one at all. And it bothers a lot of people because of what many people are calling cultural invasion. Well, that they're coming in here changing our culture, and it's kind of like what's going on in the political world right now, America. And America has been changing since it was created. And if you go near the southern border, you're going to find a lot of people speak Spanish and English. And they're going to have a lot of Spanish traditions. Okay, that's fine. But a lot of people say, no, we have to keep our language pure, like the French I was telling you the French was doing, because this is our language, and it defines our country. If you go up next to Canada, you'll find a lot of people that speak Canadian and French, or Canadian English and French, and it's okay, but we're still America. But a lot of people get the language is the nationality. I mentioned to you that I was in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, both former Soviet republics. When the Soviet Union had control of them, they spoke Russian. And they were kind of forbid to speak their language, much like what we did to the Native Americans. That if when the white men sent them to school to make them better and da 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 da, they actually would beat them if they spoke in their language. And so in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they spoke Russian. I can get around in those countries because I can speak a little bit of Russian. Now that they've had their independence for 20-something years, they have gone back to their former language, Kazakh and Kyrgyz. They're both kind of the same. They have some Chinese elements to them because it's right between China and Russia. Is where that area of land is. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. You've heard of those stands? Pakistan, Afghanistan, that area. So they are now speaking their language. And it's a thing of pride. You know, we want to speak our language. We don't want to be the dominated group and speak somebody else's language. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you think about the American language, you know, we talk about a rucksack. Anybody ever heard of a rucksack? That's a German word. How about kindergarten? Kindergarten is a German word. It's something that I really didn't realize until I read this chapter, that German was like the second language in the United States for years. But thanks to World War I and World War II, we kind of got rid of that. So there's a lot of words that we say that are other countries' words that we've adopted into our language. The internet is mostly English, but a lot of countries are trying to promote their own country on their websites. A lot of businesses have multicultural, multi-language websites because they know that they want to appease the masses. I know that when I travel, if I go to another country, I learn to say please, thank you, where's the bathroom, how to order a beer, and a few other things in their language. Because if you say, bitte schön, German please, pardon moi, pardon me in French, if you say something like that, and danke schön, and placebo, in different language, if you use the words to show you're trying, then they are more willing to use English words to help you get along. If you don't speak English, then they're going to be, yeah, I don't. Because it's insulting to them. That's the nationalism part of this. There's a whole bunch more in the text about the spreading of the English language. It's very good reading, but I don't want to take up a whole lot of video with it. So thank you much. I'll see you next time. Y'all have a good one. Bye.